I need to start by saying that anytime I'm in a city where there are skyscrapers and water, I know I'm not in Kansas anymore. I say that because oftentimes people drop the Kansas off of Brown versus the Board of Education. Well, it's Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. But there's another little piece in there that we go around trying to make people aware of. Legal cases also have that little phrase of et al. So it's Oliver L. Brown et al. Versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas et al. The et als are hundreds of people who were litigants in this case, hundreds of families who stood up for an injustice, if you will. As I listened to our first panelist, I thought immediately about man's inhumanity to man. And what Brown v. Board really was all about was a pushing back, so that inhumanity could be overcome. We live in a country that at its core, it talks about justice and equality and fairness and, we the people. But we the people has never meant we the people of color. It never meant we the women. It never meant we the people who are disabled. It never meant we the aging. There's a whole group of people that Brown v. Board, once a court ruled in that decision, was able to make a difference. It dismantled the legal framework for a lot of the things that were going on in this country. Now, the PowerPoint that I brought with me is just kind of a little reminder to all of you about the significance of that case. The Brown is considered one of the most significant judicial decisions in this nation's history. And it is so principally because the court interpreted the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which said that everybody in this room had a right not to have their rights arbitrarily restricted by state and local governments. You see, my parents grew up in a crucible of contradictions, if you will, the United States of America. They grew up at a time that education was very traditional. You did the Pledge of Allegiance in the morning. You learned the country's anthems. It was all about being a good citizen. But they did this in a setting that was segregated. Now, in a city like Topeka, we lived any place we could afford to live. But you couldn't go to the neighborhood school if that neighborhood school was a segregated school for white children. You were assigned to a certain school. So living in this crucible of contradiction, you ask yourselves, you pledge allegiance, but this nation was showing little allegiance to its people of color. So my parents at the age of 30 and 32, when the NAACP knocked on our door, happily joined this campaign. And the interesting thing about the title of what we're doing here today is Witness to History. In this case, history is something that happened to us. History happens to people. Sometimes you don't go out looking for it, which clearly they did not. But it knocked on their door quite literally. When the NAACP came to our home, asking if my parents were willing to join this campaign, my parents willingly said yes. Everybody wants better for the next generation, if you will. Recognizing the injustice and the inequality that was present. Recognizing that this was an opportunity to stand up and be counted. My father, like so many African-American men of his era, lived in the margins of this country. Just about invisible. And when you talk about man's inhumanity to man, it's only done because there is benefit for someone. Race is nothing real. It is a social construct. And it is a social construct organized and come up with and codified for somebody's benefit. Sadly, in this country, it's for the majority population's benefit. Always had been. So you create systems that go along with it. You deny opportunity to this group because it advantages this group. And sadly, it took 105 years before something like Brown v. Board of Education could come about. The first time parents challenged in court this idea of segregated, tax-supported schools was in 1849. So from 1849 to 1954, 1849, Roberts versus the city of Boston, for anybody curious about that case. But between 1849 and 1954, Now, my parents and all of the folks in that 100-year period, people that were alive, were very active around this issue. Brown didn't happen in isolation. It was part of an historic continuum. The thing is, though, our nation had many opportunities before this. 1857, Dred Scott. The United States Supreme Court had an opportunity to stop the madness, if you will, to stop the inhumanity. But instead, the court ruled that African Americans had no rights, that whites were obligated to respect. 1896, another shot. Plessy versus Ferguson. What did the Supreme Court do? Reaffirmed again. Let's keep those folks separate. But we're going to add that little lie that it's going to be separate but equal, when separate was never intended to be equal. So by the time you roll into the late 40s, into the 50s, when Brown v. Board began to take shape, people recognize that, wait a minute, we have a Constitution over here that the country is absolutely ignoring. We have this 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment over here that came about after the Civil War. And that 14th Amendment says that I am a citizen. It says that I have equal protection under the law. So my parents and all the young folks that were working in Brown v. Board and all of the civil rights initiatives that came out of that era, all of a sudden thought, you know, we need to be using the very fabric of this nation to force the nation to demand that the nation take responsibility, to live up to its constitutional promise. So Brown v. Board was also largely about something as simple. It wasn't just children in schools. It was also about the human tendencies that we have, and I probably went too fast past the last slide. But the human tendencies that we have to prejudge people, to discriminate against people, to stereotype people that are not like us. It's a human tendency. So what we were really expecting the law to do was to overcome something that's really all about what's in your heart and what's in your head, which is why I think we still struggle with those issues. But the one thing Brown did was create an opportunity. That's what makes us so proud that our name is carried by this case. It made such a monumental difference. Now, Dad tried so many different things, not knowing that this unintended legacy would land in his lap. He died in 1961 at the age of 42. So he didn't really live long enough to see how significant this case would become, how it would become a legal precedent for everything that would come after dealing with the 14th Amendment. He didn't live long enough to see it would make a difference for women when women were going through in the 1980s, the women's movement. It would make a difference for people that were aging, so we had legislation that would protect them as well. It would make a difference for people that were seeking marriage equality. It is the pivot for everything that came after, which is why it makes it so significant. But my father, you know, young guy, young black guy in the United States, you know, what am I going to do? I marry my high school sweetheart, you know. We decide we're going to settle into the traditional life. She's going to stay home and raise the kids. I'm going to go out and earn the living. He worked at a mortuary for a while. He drove a coal truck. He decided that he wanted to be a boxer. That was interesting. He thought Joe Louis was, you know, the be-all and end-all. He kind of looked like Joe Louis, and you'll see his photo here in a minute. But the interesting thing about that experience, he boxed in the Golden Gloves, and the first time he was knocked out, we think he was called into the ministry, because after that he became a minister. So he decided, you know, this rough and tumble boxing thing is not for me. And he was civic-minded. He wanted to be more of a leader in the community. For African-American men during that era, being a minister gave you not only prestige, but it provided you the leadership ability that he sought. So he found that final way of being that community leader that he'd always wanted to be. When you look at the roster, Brown v. Board, that's on the screen, you'll see it's a combination of 5 cases. So it was a lot of young people out there. So it was Kansas, Delaware, South Carolina, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. All of these cases came together. All of them sought the same relief, so the Supreme Court combined them under the heading of Brown v. Board of Education. So how it happened, quite frankly, now that I've told you about its importance for all of us, and I hope I haven't clicked one too many, how it happened. You see on the screen kind of the team, if you will, the dream team for the Brown v. Board Topeka case. It took a community organizer. That's a familiar phrase, huh? The community organizer on the screen, McKinley Burnett. He was the one that knocked on the doors and talked to people, got them rallied, got them emboldened to take this risk. And then you'll see the attorneys for the NAACP in Topeka, Charles Scott, his brother John Scott, their partner Charles Bledsoe. The only woman you'll see on the panel, Lucinda Todd, was one tough cookie. Because the interesting thing about Kansas is small towns were never segregated. And in Topeka, you only went to segregated schools up to 8th grade. Then you were in integrated settings for academics only. Separate basketball teams, separate football teams, separate cheerleading squad, separate proms, total insanity, if you will. The next person on the screen is my dad, the one in the clerical collar, Oliver Brown, who lent his name to something that will last, something that will go on in perpetuity. Something that we're very proud of, but something that calls on us to make certain we tell people that it was part of a collective action. And we challenge you, anytime you see something, anytime you see the smallest injustice, it's time to speak up. There are people that will think and feel just like you do. Pull them together. So even though Brown v. Board of Education was a Supreme Court decision, it came out of a collective action. And if you want to make it interesting and humorous, just think about that young guy laying there on the mat after being knocked out in a boxing match. And he got up on his feet and ended up making history that makes a difference for each and every one of us in this room. Thank you.